In our i5 2500K and i7 2600K revisits, we promised to also revisit one of AMD's older CPUs against a modern suite of processors, but we weren't sure at the time which one to revisit. The Phenom II series eventually struck us as a perfect option to cover once again, given its widespread adoption and high ratings on old product pages, and it's quite old at this point, but still something that people use. AMD's flagship Phenom II CPUs were all built on 45nm fabrication process and targeted to compete with 45nm Linfield Core i5 CPUs from the Nehalem line. Today we're revisiting the Phenom II CPUs. Before that, this video is brought to you by Corsair's new Vengeance RGB LED RAM, which ships with custom screened ICs for better overclocking performance and stability. Given that memory is highly relevant for performance with new Ryzen CPUs, now is a good time to do research on high-performance kits. Start with the Vengeance RGB LED kit at the link in the description below. To provide some historical context on these CPUs, AMD launched two Phenom II X6 CPUs in April of 2010, starting with the 1055T, which we have here, and the 1090T Black Edition, which we've got right here, that we're revisiting today. This launch had the 1090T priced at $295 out of the gate, and the 1055T priced at $200 originally, though it dropped a little bit later in December of 2011 down to $150 MSRP for the 1055T, with the 1090T also seeing reductions. This reduction was partly in response to Sandy Bridge, which came out in early 2011, and also in response to AMD's new architecture, Bulldozer, which came out after the Phenom II line. So that gives everyone some basic context. The 1090T Black Edition was the higher end option, and the 1055T was more of the mid-range unit, again at $200. And the Phenom II CPUs had a really short period to shine, but they did shine when they launched. They competed with the i5 Nehalem CPUs directly. That would be Linfield of the time, again 2010, first quarter, first half anyway. And later on, about 1 year later, first half of 2011, the Sandy Bridge line would begin to ship, with the first round of CPUs hitting market in first quarter of 2011, meaning that Phenom II was sandwiched between what is arguably one of Intel's best architectures, or at least most interesting even compared to today's, given the limited gains from Intel lately, and one of AMD's next architectures, Bulldozer. Phenom II was right before those two launches, so it was limited, and we're revisiting it today to bring everyone up to speed on the time. Looking back to Onintech's initial review, we see that they indicated the Phenom II has performed well against Intel's 2010 quad-core CPUs for production, though we're behind in lightly threaded applications like games. That's somewhat familiar, even 7 years later with Ryzen and Intel's current Kaby Lake CPUs. After launch, these two AMD Phenom II CPUs were followed by the 1035T, 1045T, a different 1055T than the one we tested, a 1065T, a 1075T, and finally the 1100T Black Edition CPU. Just like Ryzen, these CPUs weren't actually different beyond some clock and voltage changes, which means that overclocking a 1055T to 1090T clocks would get you the same performance, just like overclocking a 1700 to an 1800X clock would get you the same performance on Ryzen. Before jumping into the tests, we've got an overclocking chart on the screen now. Note that testing methodology and overclocking details are linked in the article below, including some of the guides we referenced for overclocking phenoms. These were a bit different to overclock than the chips of today, and there are a few more numbers to tune. We've got them on the screen, but more information in the article for the rest on that. Let's open up with some rendering and synthetic benchmarks, starting with Blender. Blender kicks us off on the X6 CPUs and should be an interesting place to gauge how some of the earliest consumer 6 cores have held on. At stock speeds, the 1055T is officially the slowest CPU we've tested in Blender, taking nearly 2 hours to render the 4K image that an i7 2600K completed in 73.9 minutes. The 1090T didn't fare much better, at about 100 minutes to complete. For a modern comparison from AMD, the R7 1700 at $330 that we praised recently is priced similarly to the aged Phenom II 1090T, but completes the same render in 30 minutes, stock settings. Overclocking the Phenom II CPUs allows the render to finish significantly faster, with a 26.8% reduction in time required for the 1055T, which is now down to 80 minutes, and a 19.1% reduction in time required for the 1090T. That lands both CPUs ahead of the overclocked 2500K, ahead of the stock FX 8370, which was released several years later, and about 2% behind the i5 4690K. To refresh everyone, the 4690K uses 22nm process and launched 4 years after the 1055T and 1090T with a launch MSRP that was $45 higher. A more blender-ready CPU, like the 2600K, which was a hyper-threaded i7, completes the render in 74 minutes stock, or about 55 minutes when overclocked. Cinebench is a synthetic benchmark that got a lot of focus during Ryzen's launch and marketing, so we're going to include it here to provide some comparisons and baselines against modern CPUs. The extra threads on the Phenom II X6 CPU benefit us with this test, pushing the stock 1090T ahead of the i5 2500K, or the overclocked 1090T and 1055T overclocked ahead of the overclocked 2500K again. We end up just behind the 4690K once again when considering only multi-threaded performance. That said, in single-threaded performance, both the 1055T OC and 1090T OC score lower than every CPU except the FX8370 piledriver CPU, which again launched after both the 1055T and 1090T. We'll point out that the 2600K cost $317 at launch, $22 higher MSRP than the 1090T, and 30% greater in stock performance in Cinebench multi-threaded, although the processors had probably been discounted by then. The SNB launch came shortly after Phenom II, and Bulldozer later drove prices down. To compare against AMD CPUs today, the X6 1090T overclock performance lands it at 596 multi-threaded and 104 single-threaded, whereas the R7 1700 stock performance lands it at 1421 multi-threaded and 149 single-threaded. The R7 1700 stock CPU performs about 2.4 times faster in multi-threaded Cinebench testing than the Phenom II 1090T overclocked CPU, which was the flagship of its era. Like Blender, Adobe Premiere gives us a real-world benchmark of the CPU's rendering performance. Our Premiere test uses our EVGA ICX review posted in February, but it was also a test built for modern CPUs, like Ryzen. The poor Phenom II chips, sadly, have a lot in front of them to handle because this is a heavy workload built for modern processors. To give perspective on how the Phenom IIs have aged in Premiere, we see that our overclocked 1055T completed rendering in 246 minutes, or over 4 hours. This would be the same time requirement as the 1090T overclocked for what it's worth, in the same way that an overclocked 1700 and an overclocked 1800X have the same clock-for-clock performance when you're testing in any application at all, really. Like POV ray tests that are in the article, the Premiere test has only recently been introduced and therefore is limited in how many devices are on the bench. The previous maximum time was 163.6 minutes for the i5 7600K, with a minimum CPU render time of 58 minutes on the 6900K. CUDA renders of the same scene completed in about 20 minutes, and the R7 1700 finished in 73 minutes stock, or about 62 minutes when overclocked, which again was impressive for that CPU. At this point, almost any modern affordable GPU will way out-render the Phenoms in Premiere. And if you're looking to upgrade CPUs, the R7 CPUs breeze past the Phenoms a few times over when looking strictly at the production workloads, which is where Ryzen shines. For 3D Mark charts and notes on time spy issues, check the article linked in the description below. But now we're going to get started with some of our game benchmarks. We look first to Watch Dogs 2 for a modern, heavily threaded title. Our overclocked 1055T outperforms the 1090T in this title thanks to higher memory frequency, but the average is still just 48 FPS, or about 27% increased over stock performance. The next CPU up is the i3 6300, which netted 54 FPS average, 41 1% lows, and 34 0.1% lows. That's about 13% faster in averages than the overclocked Phenom II CPUs. And a modern R7 1700 priced around $330 performs at 84 FPS stock, or in the 90s when overclocked. The 7700K, for perspective, pushes 113 FPS average when under stock configurations. The Phenom II CPUs would bottleneck most modern video cards in this game, including the GTX 1060, RX 480, and RX 580 and up cards. And so if this is what you're running and you're trying to upgrade video cards, it's probably time to upgrade the CPU as well. Moving now to Total War Warhammer, the Phenom II X6 1055T CPU operates at 65 FPS average, with the overclocked 1055T at 83 FPS average for an uplift of 28%. That puts it behind the i5 2500K from 2011, about a year after the Phenom launched, and that's at 92 FPS average for the 2500K. Note that the 2500K has not been retested with the Total War patch that improves frame time performance for all CPUs, including Intel and AMD Ryzen processors. This means that any CPU you see in this chart without an asterisk next to its name would perform a few percentage points higher in averages with the patch, and there would be bigger gains for low values, so keep that in mind. That said, it's only a few percentage points in averages, so this still serves as a good comparison considering we're looking at a chip that is 7 years old. The 1090T's higher core overclock isn't as helpful as the memory overclock on the 1055T, showing an additional choke point in the platform. And finally, the i7 2600K before the Warhammer patch ran its FPS at around 113 FPS average. GTA 5 has had some issues with higher frame rates that we've recently detailed and originally exposed in January, but as these Phenom devices are slow enough to dodge the higher speed issues, we can still use GTA for this test. The 1055T overclocked 6-core runs an average FPS of about 81 with stock performance at around 62 FPS average. Lows are reasonable across the board as we don't encounter the stutter issue at this low of a frame rate. And the i5 2500K runs its average at 101 FPS, the lowest scoring Intel device on the bench. AMD's FX 8370, for point of reference, was the previous lowest scorer on the bench at a 93 FPS average, making it around 15% faster than the overclocked 1055T. Battlefield 1 overclocking the 1055T or 1090T CPUs improves us to north of 60 FPS across averages and lows, smoothing over frame times and producing a frame rate that nears the FX 8370 CPU. Keep in mind, of course, that if you're playing heavily loaded multiplayer matches with a lot of actors on the screen, these numbers will go down, but they would go down linearly, and we're just looking at deltas here anyway. For point of reference, the i7 2600K operates at about 118 FPS average when stock, about 132 FPS average overclocked, and the 2500K runs its average at about 115 FPS stock. And finally, Ashes of the Singularity was basically non-functional with this CPU. We had some issues with DX12 games in general, and Time Spy was another one, which is a DX12 test. So there are some issues that we ran into with DX12. We were able to run some of those tests like Ashes. It's just the performance was really not great to the point that it's not worth talking about in the video. However, if you want to see the Ashes charts, including escalation, they're linked in the article in the description below, so that you can read them in the article there by Patrick Lathan. But talking about the conclusion here, so the Phenom II, it's kind of fun to revisit because the historical context of the Phenom II when it launched, that was a pretty serious era for CPUs. We're looking at just after that launch, just after 2011, there was sort of a stagnation for our market, for the enthusiast market, in terms of CPU performance and growth from basically 2011 until now, more or less, because any of the Intel upgrades in between have been pretty unexciting if you're running something like a Cinebench CPU already. In fact, we've said a few times lately that a 2600K to maybe a 7700K, ignoring AMD for a moment, if you're looking at linear upgrades only, that's pretty good. But anything below that was really unexciting. And the Phenom II hasn't aged in quite the same way that the 2600K has, but it's also a bit older. It's 45 nanometer manufacturing process, and it competed with Nehalem, the Linfield CPUs on the i5s. So that's even a generation back from Sandy Bridge. That's how far back we're looking. They did well for considering how old they are. But yeah, if you have one, it's probably time to start thinking about an upgrade at least, especially if you're already looking at GPU upgrades, because you're definitely bottlenecking any type of modern GPU for the most part. Maybe the $100 GPUs would skate by, but anything over that, CPU upgrades in order. Now, that said, the stuff to look at would be Ryzen. So we have our Ryzen tests. The most recent one would probably be the Ryzen Revisit. That's what we would encourage you to look at because that's got the most up-to-date numbers from us. And then we also revisited the 2600K and 2500K. If you're interested in those types of tests, we have a bit more commentary on the era and the performance of those chips there. But overall, pretty fun project. It is always cool to look back in history. Phenom 2 came out before we started reviewing CPUs officially. So there was a bit of a learning process just to read about all the old architectures. Always fun to do. If you like this type of content, you can support us directly on patreon.com/gamersnexus. We used some of that money to buy a Phenom II 1090T Black Edition, which, believe it or not, $100 for this thing on eBay. It was one of the cheapest ones there. So the price is not that different from what they used to be. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out there, or store.gamersnexus.net for shirts like these we just restocked with tri-blends. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time. Ryzen, 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 Ryzen.